In a quiet corner of Manchester, 8-year-old Emma clutched her homemade drawing tighter as the black cars pulled up outside her community centre. She had no idea that the elderly gentleman stepping out, adjusting his tie with a gentle smile, would change not just her afternoon, but her entire outlook on what royalty really means. This wasn't the fairy tale version of kingship that lives in storybooks. This was something far more powerful, a monarch who understood that real change happens one conversation, one handshake, one genuine moment at a time. What Emma witnessed that day was part of a quiet revolution that has been unfolding across Britain, led by two people who have transformed the very meaning of royal duty. King Charles III and Queen Camilla have spent decades proving that the most profound impact doesn't always make headlines. It happens in school halls, community gardens, and local libraries where real people face real challenges. This is the story of how a king and queen chose to measure their reign not in ceremonies and state dinners, but in the lives they've touched and the communities they've helped flourish. It's a story that reveals the true power of authentic leadership and shows us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply showing up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Burnley as King Charles III stepped out of the royal car, his weathered hands smoothing down his coat. The industrial town in Lancashire had seen better days, with many of its traditional mills standing empty, their brick facades telling stories of a bygone era. But Charles saw something different in those weathered buildings and determined faces of the locals who had gathered to meet him. He saw opportunity. Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher turned community organizer, had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. She clutched a folder filled with proposals, photographs, and dreams that she hoped might catch the attention of someone who could make a difference. When she first heard that the then Prince Charles was interested in grassroots community projects, she thought it was just another royal photo opportunity. She couldn't have been more wrong. Charles walked directly toward the small crowd that had gathered outside the Burnley Youth Centre, bypassing the formal reception line that protocol demanded. His security detail shifted nervously, but Charles had made it clear years ago that his visits would be about genuine connection, not ceremonial distance. He approached Margaret first, drawn by the intensity in her eyes and the worn folder she held like a treasure. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, her voice slightly trembling, "I've been working with young people in this community for over 20 years, and I have something I think you need to see." Charles paused, studying her face with the kind of attention that surprised everyone watching. "Please, call me Charles," he said quietly. "And I have all the time in the world to hear what you have to say." What Margaret showed him that day would become the blueprint for dozens of similar projects across the United Kingdom. Inside her folder were before and after photographs of abandoned lots transformed into community gardens, testimonials from teenagers who had found purpose through local apprenticeship programs, and detailed plans for turning empty buildings into hubs of learning and creativity. The story she told was one that Charles had heard in various forms across the country, but Margaret's approach was different. She wasn't asking for handouts or quick fixes. She was asking for partnership, for someone to believe in the community's ability to heal itself with the right support and recognition. "We don't need saving," Margaret explained as they walked through the youth center, past walls covered with artwork created by local children. "We need someone to see what we're already doing and help us do it better." Charles stopped in front of a mural painted by a group of teenagers, depicting their vision of Burnley's future. Solar panels gleamed on refurbished buildings, gardens bloomed in former parking lots, and people of all ages worked together in spaces that buzzed with activity and hope. It wasn't a fantasy, it was a carefully researched plan based on successful community-led initiatives from around the world. The king spent the next 4 hours in Burnley, far longer than his schedule allowed. He visited the community garden where elderly residents worked alongside recent immigrants, sharing gardening techniques and stories from their homeland. He met with young entrepreneurs who had started a furniture restoration business in a former mill, breathing new life into discarded pieces while learning valuable skills. At the local library, now also serving as a community college satellite campus, Charles sat in on a literacy class where adults who had missed educational opportunities in their youth were finally learning to read. The determination in their eyes reminded him of his own struggles with learning differences as a child, and the patience of teachers who refused to give up on him. But it was his conversation with 16-year-old James Morrison that truly crystallized Charles's understanding of what effective community support looked like. James had been heading toward trouble, skipping school and running with a crowd that saw no future beyond the next weekend. Then, he discovered the youth center's music production program, funded by a combination of local fundraising and a small grant from the Prince's Trust. "I never thought I was smart," James told Charles as they sat in the center's recording studio, surrounded by equipment that would have been unimaginable in this neighborhood just 5 years earlier. "School never made sense to me. But, when I started making beats, mixing tracks, working with other kids on their songs, something clicked. Now I'm applying to university for sound engineering." Charles listened intently as James played some of his original music, beats that blended traditional folk melodies with contemporary rhythms, creating something entirely new yet rooted in local culture. It was exactly the kind of innovation that emerged when communities had the resources to nurture their young people's talents rather than simply hoping they would find their way. The King's visit to Burnley wasn't an isolated event. For over 2 decades, first as Prince of Wales and, now as monarch, Charles had been quietly building relationships with community leaders across Britain. His approach was methodical and personal, focused on understanding what actually worked rather than what looked good in photographs. Dr. Sarah Williams, a social researcher who had been documenting community development programs for 15 years, noticed a pattern in the areas where Charles had maintained long-term involvement. "What's remarkable isn't just that he visits these places," she observed, "but that he returns. Year after year, sometimes decade after decade, he maintains relationships with the same communities, watching projects evolve and learning from both successes and failures." This continuity of engagement had created something unprecedented in royal history. Instead of ceremonial visits that began and ended with the appearance itself, Charles had developed a network of grassroots partnerships that operated more like an extended family than a traditional royal patronage system. The economic impact of this approach was measurable but often unexpected. In Burnley, the youth centre that had impressed Charles during his visit had become a model replicated in 12 other post-industrial towns across northern England. The furniture restoration business that started with 6 teenagers now employed 42 people and had contracts with hotels and restaurants across Lancashire. More importantly, the social fabric of these communities had strengthened in ways that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. Crime rates had dropped, school attendance had improved, and young people were choosing to stay in their hometowns rather than fleeing to larger cities at the first opportunity. Margaret Thompson had watched her community transform over the years since Charles's first visit, but she never lost sight of what made the difference. "He doesn't come here to fix us," she reflected. "He comes here to learn from us, and somehow that makes all the difference. When someone of his position genuinely listens to what you have to say, it changes how you see yourself and what you think is possible." The ripple effects extended far beyond individual communities. Other members of the royal family began adopting similar approaches to their charitable work, and local government officials started paying attention to initiatives they had previously overlooked. Corporate sponsors, initially attracted by the royal connection, discovered that community-led projects often delivered better results than top-down charitable programs. Charles's diary was filled with similar visits across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Each community had its own character, its own challenges, and its own innovations. In the Scottish Highlands, he worked with communities developing sustainable tourism that showcased local culture without overwhelming it. In Welsh valleys, he supported programs that helped former miners transition to renewable energy jobs while maintaining their community's strong sense of identity. The approach wasn't without its critics. Some argued that royal involvement, however well-intentioned, created dependency or gave undue influence to one person's vision of community development. Others questioned whether resources devoted to small-scale local projects might be better used for larger systemic changes. Charles addressed these concerns directly in conversations with community leaders, academics, and his own staff. His response was both practical and philosophical. "We can't wait for perfect solutions to emerge from distant institutions," he would often say. "Real change happens when real people in real places have the support they need to solve their own problems." As evening approached in Burnley, Charles prepared for his departure, but not before making commitments that would extend far beyond his visit. He promised to connect Margaret with similar community organizers in other parts of the country, to help the youth center access additional funding for their expanded programs, and to return in 18 months to see how their initiatives had developed. These weren't empty promises. His staff maintained detailed records of every commitment made during community visits, and Charles personally reviewed progress reports from each location. The communities knew they could count on follow-through, which encouraged them to think bigger and plan further into the future. Standing outside the youth center as his car arrived, Charles looked back at the building that hummed with activity even as the formal visit concluded. Through the windows, he could see teenagers working on art projects, adults attending computer classes, and elderly residents playing cards in a corner that had been converted into a comfortable social space. This was what success looked like in his vision of monarchy, not the grand gestures that filled newspaper headlines, but the quiet transformation of ordinary places where ordinary people were discovering extraordinary potential within themselves. Tomorrow would bring visits to other communities, other conversations, other opportunities to plant seeds of change that would grow long after the royal cars had disappeared down the road. The reading corner at Southwark Primary School buzzed with nervous excitement as 37 children aged 6 to 11 waited to meet Queen Camilla. Unlike the formal ceremonies they had seen on television, this visit felt different from the moment she walked through the school doors. Instead of a grand entrance, Camilla simply appeared in their classroom doorway, carrying a worn canvas bag and wearing the kind of comfortable, practical clothes that suggested she was ready to sit on tiny plastic chairs and get her hands dirty. "I've brought some of my favorite stories," she announced to the children, who sat cross-legged on the carpet in a perfect circle. "But first, I want to hear about your favorite books." 7-year-old Aisha raised her hand tentatively. "I like the story about the girl who plants a garden, but I don't have a garden at home." Camilla's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Tell me more about that story, Aisha. What did you like about the garden?" What followed was 20 minutes of the most natural conversation imaginable between a queen and a group of inner-city children who had never imagined that someone from the royal family would care about their thoughts on stories, dreams, and the small details of their daily lives. Camilla listened with the intensity of someone who genuinely found these conversations fascinating rather than dutiful. This scene, repeated in dozens of schools, libraries, and community centers across Britain, represented Camilla's unique contribution to the royal family's community engagement strategy. While Charles focused on economic development and environmental sustainability, Camilla had discovered her calling in literacy, education, and supporting the social infrastructure that held communities together. Her journey to this role hadn't been conventional. When she married Charles in 2005, many expected her to choose traditional royal patronages, hospitals, arts organizations, or military charities. Instead, Camilla spent months visiting schools, libraries, and adult education centers, trying to understand why reading levels in certain communities remained stubbornly low despite decades of government programs and charitable initiatives. What she discovered surprised education experts who had been working on these problems for years. The issue wasn't lack of resources or poor teaching, it was the absence of reading culture in homes and communities where books had never been part of daily life. "You can have the best schools and the most dedicated teachers," explained Dr. Patricia Lewis, a literacy researcher who began collaborating with Camilla's office, but if children go home to environments where reading isn't valued or modeled, they struggle to see it as relevant to their lives. Camilla's solution was characteristically direct and personal. Instead of launching another top-down literacy program, she began working with existing community organizations to create what she called reading families, networks of support that made books and storytelling part of the social fabric of neighborhoods. The approach started small, with Camilla visiting libraries in areas with low literacy rates and simply reading stories to children and their parents together. But these weren't performative readings designed for media coverage. They were genuine attempts to demonstrate that shared reading could be both fun and accessible, regardless of anyone's educational background or social status. Mrs. Fatima Hassan, a mother of 4 in Tower Hamlets, remembered her first encounter with Camilla at their local library. "I was embarrassed because my English isn't perfect, and I thought she would judge me for not reading well to my children. But she sat next to me and helped me sound out words I didn't know, just like I was one of the kids. She made me feel like my effort was important." That interaction led to something neither Fatima nor Camilla had planned. Other parents in the community, seeing that the queen consort treated struggling readers with patience and encouragement rather than judgment, began attending the library's family reading sessions. Within 6 months, the program had expanded from a weekly story time for 12 people to daily activities serving over 200 families. But Camilla's impact extended beyond individual communities. She had begun to understand that literacy wasn't just about teaching people to read, it was about creating social connections that strengthened entire neighborhoods. Parents who met at reading sessions began organizing other activities. Children who struggled with reading at school found confidence when they could help younger kids with picture books. The ripple effects were documented by researchers who studied communities where Camilla had maintained long-term involvement. Test scores improved, but so did school attendance, community participation, and what sociologists called social cohesion, the invisible bonds that help neighborhoods weather challenges and support their most vulnerable members. In Cornwall, Camilla's work with rural libraries had led to the creation of book exchanges in village shops, pubs, and community centers. What started as simple shelves of donated books became gathering places where isolated residents connected with neighbors and visitors shared stories about their own communities. The landlord of the Smuggler's Rest pub in a tiny coastal village recalled how the book exchange transformed his establishment. "We used to have mostly the same local blokes coming in for a pint and not much conversation. Now we've got families coming in for lunch who stay to browse the books, elderly folks who come for coffee and end up chatting with young parents, even tourists who leave books from their home countries and pick up local histories to take with them." These weren't dramatic transformations that made national news, but they represented exactly the kind of social infrastructure that Camilla had identified as crucial for community resilience. When people had regular, positive reasons to interact with neighbors, communities became stronger and more supportive places to live. Her approach to adult education followed similar principles. Rather than focusing solely on formal classes, Camilla supported programs that integrated learning into social activities that people already enjoyed. Cooking classes that incorporated basic math and reading skills. Gardening groups that used plant care as a gateway to literacy. Book clubs that met in pubs and coffee shops rather than intimidating institutional settings. At a community center in Birmingham, Camilla met Rose Williams, a 63-year-old grandmother who had hidden her illiteracy for decades. Rose had developed elaborate strategies to avoid situations where she might be asked to read or write, but the isolation was taking a toll on her mental health and her relationship with her grandchildren, who were beginning to notice that Grandma Rose never read them bedtime stories. "I thought she would think less of me," Rose admitted about her first conversation with Camilla. "Here's the queen, educated and proper, and I'm sitting there admitting I can barely write my own name." But she told me about her own struggles with learning when she was young, and suddenly, it didn't feel so shameful. Camilla had indeed struggled with dyslexia as a child, an experience that gave her genuine empathy for adults who had missed educational opportunities. Her openness about these difficulties helped reduce the stigma that kept many adults from seeking help with basic skills. The program Rose joined wasn't a traditional adult literacy class. Instead, it was organized around preparing family recipe books that participants could give to their children and grandchildren. Learning to read and write became part of preserving family history and cultural traditions, which made the effort feel meaningful rather than remedial. Rose's recipe book, completed after 8 months of classes, became a treasured family heirloom. More importantly, the confidence she gained allowed her to help her grandchildren with homework, volunteer at their school, and become an active member of her community in ways she had never imagined possible. Camilla's work wasn't limited to formal educational settings. She spent considerable time with organizations that supported women fleeing domestic violence, recognizing that literacy and basic education were often crucial for achieving economic independence and safety. At a refuge in Manchester, she met women whose abusive partners had deliberately sabotaged their education or isolated them from opportunities to develop skills. These women faced the dual challenge of rebuilding their lives while often lacking the basic qualifications needed for employment that could support them and their children. The traditional approach would have been to enroll these women in formal educational programs, but Camilla worked with shelter staff to develop something more flexible and supportive. Classes were offered on-site, childcare was provided, and the curriculum was designed around practical skills that would immediately improve the women's daily lives and job prospects. Sarah Mitchell, who left an abusive relationship with 2 young children, credited Camilla's program with giving her the foundation she needed to become independent. "It wasn't just learning to use computers or improving my math skills," Sarah explained. "It was being in a room with other women who understood what I was going through, having teachers who knew that some days I might be too anxious to concentrate, and knowing that someone as important as the Queen thought my education mattered enough to personally support programs like this." Sarah eventually completed her GED, trained as a teaching assistant, and found work at a primary school in her neighborhood. But the program's impact went beyond individual success stories. The women who participated often maintained connections with each other, creating informal support networks that helped them navigate challenges and celebrate achievements. Camilla's staff maintained careful records of outcomes from these various initiatives, not for publicity purposes but to understand what worked and what could be improved. The data revealed patterns that surprised even experienced educators and social workers. Communities where Camilla had maintained long-term involvement showed improvements not just in literacy rates, but in a wide range of social indicators. Domestic violence reports decreased, mental health services reported fewer crisis interventions, and local businesses noted increased community engagement and volunteerism. Dr. Lewis, the literacy researcher, spent 3 years studying these outcomes. Her conclusion was that Camilla had intuited something that academic research was just beginning to understand. "Literacy isn't just about individual skills," Lewis explained. "It's about social connection, community identity, and giving people tools to participate fully in civic life. When you approach it that way, you get results that go far beyond reading test scores." The Queen Consort's approach had also influenced how other organizations thought about community development. Local councils began incorporating social infrastructure considerations into their planning decisions. Libraries expanded their programming beyond traditional book services. Schools started offering more family-centered activities that brought parents and community members into educational settings. Even corporate sponsors began to see the value in supporting programs that strengthened social connections rather than just addressing specific problems. A major supermarket chain partnered with Camilla's literacy initiatives to offer cooking classes that incorporated reading and math skills, finding that the programs built customer loyalty while genuinely benefiting communities. As autumn settled over London, Camilla reflected on the afternoon she had spent at Southwark Primary School. The children who had been nervous about meeting a queen had ended up teaching her new games and showing off art projects that decorated their classroom walls. Several parents had stayed after school to chat about books their children were enjoying and to learn about the library programs available in their neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of interaction that energized her, authentic, mutually beneficial, and focused on building the kinds of relationships that made communities stronger. Tomorrow would bring visits to an adult education center in Leeds and a rural library in Devon, each with their own unique challenges and opportunities. But tonight, Camilla's thoughts returned to 7-year-old Aisha, who had wished for a garden like the one in her favorite story. Before leaving the school, Camilla had quietly spoken with the head teacher about the possibility of creating a small reading garden in the school's courtyard, where children could enjoy books outdoors and perhaps even grow some of the plants they read about in stories. It was the kind of small, practical gesture that perfectly captured her approach to royal duty, finding ways to make the dreams of ordinary people a little more achievable, one conversation and one community at a time. The morning of the community festival in Newcastle dawned crisp and clear, with volunteers arriving before sunrise to set up stalls, sound systems, and the dozens of displays that would showcase 5 years of collaborative work between local organizations and the royal couple's community initiatives. This wasn't a celebration organized for Charles and Camilla, it was a celebration organized by the communities themselves, with the King and Queen Consort attending as honored guests rather than the central focus. Trevor Matthews, a former shipyard worker who had become a community organizer after losing his job in the industry's decline, surveyed the bustling preparations with satisfaction. 5 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be coordinating an event like this, I'd have laughed, he admitted to the local newspaper reporter who was documenting the day's activities. But that's what happens when people start believing in what their communities can accomplish. The transformation Trevor referenced hadn't happened overnight. It began with a series of conversations between Charles, Camilla, and local leaders who were struggling to address unemployment, social isolation, and the loss of economic purpose that had followed the closure of traditional industries. Unlike previous government programs that imposed solutions from outside, the Royal Initiative had focused on asking communities what they wanted to achieve and, then, finding ways to support those goals. The festival itself told the story of those 5 years through living demonstrations rather than speeches or formal presentations. Visitors could watch teenagers who had learned traditional boat-building skills working alongside master craftsmen to restore a 19th-century fishing vessel. Elderly residents shared stories and historical photographs at a community archive project that had documented decades of local history that might otherwise have been lost. At the community kitchen, women who had started a cooperative catering business served traditional Geordie dishes alongside international cuisines contributed by newer residents from Somalia, Poland, and Bangladesh. The fusion wasn't just culinary, it represented the kind of social integration that happened naturally when people worked together on shared projects rather than being segregated by background or circumstances. Charles moved through the festival with the ease of someone who had watched many of these projects develop from initial conversations to thriving enterprises. He stopped at the renewable energy demonstration where a group of former miners had retrained as solar panel installers and wind turbine technicians, bringing their industrial skills to an emerging green economy. The transition wasn't easy, explained David Robertson, who had worked underground for 23 years before the last local pit closed. But, having support to retrain, and knowing that the work we were doing was important for the community's future, made all the difference. Now we're installing solar systems for local schools and businesses, and training the next generation of renewable energy workers. The economic impact was measurable. The Renewable Energy Cooperative had created 42 full-time jobs and generated enough surplus income to fund additional community projects. But the social impact was equally significant. Workers who had felt discarded by economic changes had found new purpose and pride in their abilities, while young people who might have left the area for opportunities elsewhere were staying to build careers in emerging industries. Camilla's presence at the festival was most visible in the literacy and education displays, but her influence extended throughout the event. The festival's organization itself reflected principles she had championed: inclusive planning that involved all community members, activities that brought different generations together, and celebration of local culture alongside welcome for newcomers. At the storytelling tent, professional authors worked alongside community members to help visitors write short pieces about their own experiences and neighborhood memories. The project had grown from Camilla's observation that many communities had rich oral traditions but lacked confidence in their ability to record and share those stories more widely. Amara Ali, a Somali refugee who had arrived in Newcastle 3 years earlier, read a piece she had written about her first winter in England and how neighbors had helped her family navigate both the weather and the social services system. Her story drew applause not just for its honest portrayal of the challenges facing new residents, but for its celebration of the ordinary kindness that had made her family feel welcome. Writing this helped me understand my own experience better, Amara explained to visitors who gathered around after her reading. But hearing other people's stories made me realize that everyone in this community has had to adapt and overcome difficulties. It's not just immigrants who face challenges, it's something that brings us together rather than separating us. The success of individual projects was impressive, but what struck visitors most was the sense of connection and shared purpose that had developed across the community. People who had been strangers 5 years earlier now worked together on multiple initiatives, creating networks of mutual support that extended far beyond any single program. Dr. Michael Chen, a social scientist from Newcastle University who had been documenting the community development process, pointed to this social cohesion as the most significant outcome of the royal couple's engagement strategy. What they've achieved here isn't just a collection of successful projects, he observed. It's a fundamental shift in how community members see themselves and their collective capacity to address challenges and create opportunities. The festival also demonstrated how the model developed in Newcastle had influenced communities across Britain. Representatives from similar initiatives in Wales, Scotland, and other parts of England had travelled to share their experiences and learn from each other's innovations. The royal couple had facilitated these connections, understanding that communities could often learn more from peers than from external experts or government officials. In the afternoon, Charles and Camilla participated in a panel discussion with community leaders from a dozen different towns and cities, moderated by a local radio presenter who had covered their initiatives from the beginning. The conversation wasn't a formal presentation but a genuine exchange of ideas about what had worked, what had been difficult, and what lessons might be applicable in other contexts. The discussion revealed both the diversity of approaches that had emerged in different communities and the common principles that seemed to underlie successful initiatives. Local ownership of projects, long-term commitment from supporters, integration of economic and social goals, and celebration of existing community strengths while addressing identified needs. Margaret Thompson, the former teacher from Burnley who had first impressed Charles with her community development vision, had traveled to Newcastle for the festival. Her own community's transformation had become a model replicated in other post-industrial towns, but she was most proud of how the approach had evolved and improved through adaptation to different local circumstances. What started as one community's response to specific challenges has become a movement, Margaret reflected during the panel discussion. But it's not a movement imposed from outside, it's communities discovering their own power to create change and supporting each other to achieve things none of us could accomplish alone. The economic impact of these community initiatives had caught the attention of government officials and business leaders who initially viewed them as interesting but small-scale charitable efforts. A study commissioned by the Treasury had found that communities with sustained royal engagement showed higher rates of employment, lower social services costs, reduced crime, and increased small business development compared to similar areas without such support. More significantly, these communities had demonstrated resilience during recent economic challenges that had devastated other areas. The networks of local businesses, community organizations, and trained workers that had developed through years of collaborative effort provided social and economic buffers that helped residents weather difficulties and adapt to changing circumstances. Corporate leaders had begun seeking partnerships with communities that had demonstrated this kind of adaptive capacity. The Renewable Energy Cooperative in Newcastle had secured contracts with major construction firms that valued both their technical skills and their community connections. The furniture restoration business in Burnley had expanded into antique repair and custom woodworking, serving clients from across northern England. But success was measured in more than economic terms. Health indicators had improved in communities with strong royal engagement, with lower rates of mental health crises, substance abuse, and domestic violence. Educational outcomes had improved not just through direct literacy programs but through the broader culture of learning and mutual support that had developed. Children growing up in these communities were more likely to see their neighborhoods as places of opportunity rather than limitation. They had adult mentors beyond their immediate families, exposure to diverse career possibilities, and confidence that their own contributions to community life were valued and important. As evening approached and the festival began to wind down, Charles and Camilla took a final walk through the displays and demonstrations that showcased 5 years of collaborative achievement. They stopped frequently to chat with individuals whose lives had been touched by various initiatives, but also to thank volunteers whose work had made the day's celebration possible. The conversations were relaxed and personal, reflecting relationships that had deepened through years of sustained engagement rather than occasional ceremonial visits. These weren't subjects meeting their monarch, they were collaborators reflecting on shared accomplishments and planning future endeavors. 8-year-old Emma, now 13 and serving as a junior volunteer at the festival, approached Charles with the same directness she had shown as a younger child. "Thank you for keeping your promises," she said simply. "You said you would come back and help our community grow, and you did." Charles knelt to meet her eyes, just as he had 5 years earlier. "Thank you for showing me what was possible," he replied. "Your community taught me as much as I hope we were able to contribute." It was the kind of exchange that captured the essence of their approach to royal duty: mutual respect, genuine relationship, and recognition that the most meaningful change emerged from collaboration rather than charity. The drive back to London took Charles and Camilla through several communities where they had maintained similar long-term engagements. Street lights illuminated renovated buildings, community gardens, and the subtle signs of neighborhoods that had found new energy and purpose through residents' own efforts supported by sustained partnership. The day had reinforced their conviction that the monarchy's most important role in contemporary Britain wasn't ceremonial representation but practical facilitation of community empowerment. They had discovered that their position provided unique opportunities to connect people and resources, to encourage local innovation, and to demonstrate sustained commitment to places and people that might otherwise be overlooked by national institutions. Their approach had influenced how other members of the royal family engaged with charitable work, how government programs were designed and implemented, and how businesses thought about their responsibilities to the communities where they operated. But, perhaps most importantly, it had shown ordinary people across Britain that their own efforts to improve their neighborhoods and support their neighbors were valuable contributions to the nation's well-being. The legacy being created wasn't measured in monuments or formal honors, but in the daily lives of people who had discovered new possibilities for themselves and their communities. It was a legacy written in children's improved reading scores, adults' new job skills, neighbors' strengthened relationships, and communities' increased confidence in their collective ability to face challenges and create opportunities. As their car pulled into the palace gates, Charles and Camilla were already planning their next community visits, guided by invitations from local organizers who had their own stories to share and their own visions for collaborative achievement. The work would continue, one conversation and one community at a time, building the kind of kingdom that measured its success not in grand gestures but in ordinary people's extraordinary achievements.